Hello, this is David Lee Kim, co-founder of Omniscient Digital, and you're listening to the Long Game podcast. In this episode, I'm talking to Vasil Azarov. Vasil is the founder of Growth Marketing Conference and now founder of Growth Blazers, a leading events company in the growth marketing and tech world. I've been to multiple events hosted by Vasil and his team, both as a speaker and attendee, and they're always a great experience. Fun fact, Omniscient Digital started based on a conversation that happened at one of these events. In this conversation, we talk about how Vasil got into the events world as his first profession, what he learned about running events in a time of COVID, the future of virtual events, and his thoughts about building a community. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Vasil Azarov. All right, Vasil, it's great to have you on the Long Game. Thanks for making the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you, David.
Yeah, of course. Well, let's jump straight into it. So you are the founder of Growth Marketing Conference, built it into one of the leading conferences in growth and tech, and now you're building a new event series called Growth Blazers. And I want to jump into all of that. But first, how did you land into events as your profession? I feel like folks in events somehow land into the space in an interesting way.
Yeah, it was very interesting. So it's a decade-long journey that started with an accident, so to speak. So my background has always been in marketing, connecting people in events. But my first role was a junior social media sort of manager for the events company.
I know that.
Yeah, and what happened 2 weeks before a big kickoff of our roadshow across the US, 14 different cities, 3-day conferences, Boston, Chicago, New York, all major hubs. Half of our events, I would say 75% of our events team left the company. So there was a little bit of, I guess, a rebellion against our founder back then. And he approached me and said, Vasil, hey, do you want to do events? Right. And I was like, okay, let me try it. So I had one event where I learned the fundamentals, and I wasn't a fan at all. It was so much stress and I didn't know the logistics. So I almost was ready to quit about like 2 weeks in. And just because I felt that I was under too much pressure, but then something just clicked. And I realized that, okay, so let me give it another like couple of weeks or so. And I ended up going through that entire experience, and think of it as 2-month crash course in events, in the marketing, meeting people. I think something that really helped me shape sort of my future vision for events and my place within the industry is also the fact that we traveled and we did an event on the road. So almost every single event was kind of sort of an adventure, new adventure. Even the format was very similar, but it was a different location. It was a different story in a way. And actually through that lens, now I'm viewing events as stories or as movies in a way, because you are, as an event producer, you are co-creating these experiences where the lead actors, actually your event attendees, speakers, participants. But this is a very important part for me, that to feel it like an adventure and to be able to connect all of the elements together in one event that is useful, valuable, and memorable for attendees.
Yeah, that must explain why you were able to grow Growth Marketing Conference and now Growth Blazers to be so big and have such a loyal following. I think when I was going to Growth Marketing Conference, I'd run into the same people every year.
Yeah, and so one of the interesting thing on that though, so many people, yes, we have a core of the people who always come back to the events year after year, but also and I know it wasn't your question, but I thought it was interesting that a lot of people, you cannot measure retention for the conferences or events just like you measure product usage, because yes, you can always see the same people, the same core coming back to the events. But if they don't, not at this very single event, it doesn't mean that they have affinity to the brand, that they don't want to be there. Just the nature of the events that nobody can make to every single event, every single time, even if it's for like Dreamforce or Inbound, the events that are like industry must attend, right? Still, you don't go to every single one of them.
Yeah. Tell us more about this idea of viewing events as stories. It's the first time I've heard of that sort of analogy. So how does viewing you as a producer, as the producer of this movie or story of events, what does that look like in practice?
Yeah, so I was just thinking about it recently, actually, at the first time I'm sharing this. So the way I see event as a story or a movie, for example, from the producer standpoint, is that the right way to plan events is not to pay $50,000 for a keynote speaker like Richard Branson or whoever would it be, like in the entrepreneurship world, and then think that magic will happen and people just attend the event. It really starts from building the foundations. So or if the analogy of thinking of it as a story, just think about the script, right? So who is going to be your reader? Who is going to be your attendee? Who are all of the stakeholders of the event? Speakers, your partners, your sponsors, your attendees. And think of that event. You can think of it as a product. You can think of it as a movie. And before you pick the actors, before you figure out where you're going to shoot the movie, you have to think, who is this movie for? And what is the core? Why are you doing this? The same thing for the event. The first question is, why are you doing this event on the first place? What are your business goals? What are the goals? What is something that you stand for as an event producer? So when you have those questions answered, then the rest is it's almost like building the script. Okay, so the event, let's take a marketing event as an example, right? Let's say we are putting together an event for modern marketers. The vision is to make Silicon Valley strategies accessible to everyone globally, not just a secret Silicon Valley club that nobody can get into it. So it means the event can be global. Potentially, it could be a virtual format for it. What kind of people would you like to bring who are open to share, who are also open to, if you're a speaker, who are open to get off the stage and participate in the networking with the attendees, not somebody who will take the private jet and fly away from that event right away. So all of the things matters. If the event is upscale, if you target customers from Fortune 500 companies, right? You host it maybe in the fancier hotel. You create an experience. You don't bring them to a small co-working space or to the bar. On the other hand, if you're doing a startup event, that's a totally different journey that you're going through. So just to summarize, is thinking about it at the very core as a script, or you write the scenario as a producer. But something that is also fascinating for me is that this is actually connected with reality, and you're actually building the future. You're building these magic moments. It's not the movie that people are watching and can resonate potentially, but some people would meet at your event and they would learn something that would help them land a new job. Somebody would literally hire several people at the event. So, and you as a producer of the whole thing, if you do everything right and you facilitate these connections, you're actually changing the lives. So that
you're describing the experience I had at Growth Marketing Conference. I mean, I don't know if I told you how we ended up doing this agency, but I think my co-founder Alex and Pep from CXL were sitting at the bar at the venue, and we just came up with this business idea, and here we are a couple of years later doing it. So what you're saying is actually playing out, and I imagine I'm just one of many stories. And so you bring up this in-person experience of meeting, and the idea of also make all this information accessible, so it might be global as well. This, of course, kind of leads me down the path of COVID and everything affecting the event space in 2020. I know we had a conversation then, but how did that impact how you were thinking about events at the time, and how did you pivot and adapt?
Oh man, this was like the toughest year that I ever had, probably as an entrepreneur, as an event producer. So I can try to identify some of the sort of to walk you through my thinking process and the whole how things unfolded back then. So in February, I think this is where everybody became the whole industry got alert about COVID in general, but nobody really knew if it's something that will disappear before the summer or it's going to be here to stay. So, and it was so sad to see some of the largest events, shutting the doors, and just knowing how much it takes to plan the event for the entire year. I was watching these events that literally had to refund all of the tickets, sponsorships, and some of them went out of the business too. But I was sort of optimistic myself because we usually do events in December. So I thought like, okay, we're sort of lucky, and we're just gonna wait out. We had to cancel our small executive event around March or so. So we thought, let's just wait. But closer to about summer or so, this is where, this is real, right? And I had to make a real decision whether, we're just going to wait a little bit longer. Company lost, by the way, its revenues from sponsorships that we usually would get in the first couple of months, I would say by 80%. So we were working on the big road show that's supposed to happen. We would work with a partner to take our mixers to 9 different cities. We almost had a contract ready to go. So that fell through. All of the sponsorship contracts for the end of the year conference, they were put on hold. All the budgets got frozen. So it's really, and plus, we had a very small lean team, but still usually what ended up happening with that one big conference at the end of the year, last 3 months is when we generate 80% of the revenue. And then we know that it's sort of a slow time of the year, but at least we can estimate that at the end of the year, based on this sponsors that would come in, based on the tickets that we'll sell, we generate that percentage of revenue. Now we had like peanuts. So the goal was, there were some thoughts completely, to shut down the business right away. I had those thoughts as well.
Wow. And what made you decide to just power through it? Because that's such a big decision. What was your calculation there?
Well, to be honest, it's just personally, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. So I was like, okay, so let's see. And, maybe like gonna shut down this business. Maybe I'll get a job. Maybe I'll start something new. And I was thinking, what else can I do? What else? I'm sure I could have found a job if I want to. In fact, when I mentioned to a few people about my thoughts, I didn't even tell the team back then because there's so much that was going on in my head, but I knew that my priority would be first to take care of the team and make sure that they've been taken care of. But still, on the back of my mind, I had that thought, okay, if I would have to do something else, what can I do? And I was like, okay, I'm probably going to eventually start a new event or build a new community, right? So yeah, and that's exactly what ended up happening. But between these doubts and everything that I just described, also there were several attempts to build the virtual events arm and transition our in-person revenue model into virtual space, which was very tough. And I know I read the research. I think only about 15% of all event organizers in 2020 were able to figure out how to make money with virtual events. And I think we were one of them, but not at the scale to justify like continuing with the same business in a way. So down the road, it took us probably a year and a half overall to figure out that model right now that we're running at Growth Blazers. And one of the biggest takeaway was that if you cannot run in-person events, so if you have virtual events, if you do them on an ongoing basis, there needs to be a space where people can engage or they can learn outside of just virtual event environment. And that's where that idea of community came about, that would connect virtual events with by also providing a platform for attendees to engage. And now hopefully as in-person events coming back, which I'm super excited about, it will be more of a hybrid type of environment moving forward.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I imagine when you're switching to virtual events, it must be harder to try to replicate the magic that you would create with in-person events. How did you reconcile it? Personally, I would be a bit annoyed if I couldn't kind of create that same experience for people anymore. So, yeah. I mean, how did you work around that? What were the things you tried?
So it's impossible to recreate that. Everyone who's trying to say that, okay, what we're doing, we're just recreating the same experience that you would get like in person in the virtual events, it's just impossible. You cannot do that. So, but that being said, there's definitely some benefits of the virtual events that in-person events would never have as well. So it's not that now I'm seeing that virtual events will never go away. They're here to stay. But again, going back to that idea of writing your own script for the movie, for the product, for the community that you build in, just understanding what are you building exactly. You can utilize virtual and in-person or maybe even hybrid component by providing value to your community, to your audience in different environments. For us, for example, what we realized, now people would show up to a webinar, they would show up to a virtual event if they find the content super relevant to them and they have the speaker who they really want to catch for the Q&A or for the interactive interview or something along those lines. That would happen more likely than people would travel for a conference and they would sit in the audience, potentially even wearing masks and like watching somebody speaking from the stage. I would rather not do it. On the other hand, I know there was at some point during pandemic, virtual networking, in some platforms like, how do you call
Lunch Club is one, I think.
The what?
Lunch Club.
Oh yeah, Lunch Club, yeah. Or even some virtual event platforms. Then they have like a networking rooms where you randomly matched with someone, or sometimes it's randomly, right? So this is now I'm seeing as in person is coming back. So these types of networking will become much less relevant. So for our community, is really content that relevant audiences would consume digitally. But when it comes to really meeting people, recreating those magic moments, the energy, will happen in person. So this is what cannot wait to get back to. We actually, for the first time, we're hosting our small holiday happy hour tomorrow. So I cannot wait to see everybody in Bay Area here, but we're planning to do these mixers around the States. So
that'll be so fun. Hopefully you do a road show in Boston sometime.
Yeah, we'll be there for sure. Yeah.
So I know a couple of days ago you hosted the kickoff event for Growth Blazers, and it was Global Growth Accelerator Conference 2020. And you had folks talking about future of marketing Web3. I think we'll get to Web3 later in the conversation, but tell us about that event. How did it go? What were some learnings you had from a year of hosting virtual events that you were able to apply to making this a successful event?
Yeah, so one of the biggest learnings is really making sure that the content, at least going back to understanding what your community wants, right? And might sound very cliche, but for the virtual events, especially when you market to busy marketers, it's very, very important. So designing the agenda, if you would ask me what took the most time overall, is really planning and designing the agenda, which might seem counterintuitive because logistics, of course, takes a lot of time, and maybe my event manager would disagree with me. But I think really understanding why people are showing up live for these events, and in our case, it's content, 100%, and designing this in a way that is convenient for the audience to consume. What we did, for example, something going back to learning, something that we haven't done in the previous virtual events. So now we grouped all of the content in the segments of 2 hour, very relevant, focused content. For example, B2B focused on specific industries, or we have a product-led growth segment, or we have thought leadership keynotes, building your growth team, career growth interviews with senior marketers and CMOs. So we would encourage attendees to bookmark their calendars for these segments. Nobody will, let's face it, nobody will stay for the virtual conference for the entire day, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's much better than what I've seen where it's like scattered sessions, like, oh, I want this one at 10 a.m. and then another one at 3 p.m. and another one at 5 p.m. You need to block it out and all that. What you're saying is group them. So it's just, hey, 2 hours straight, exactly what we want to hear about without having to work around your schedule and all of that.
Yeah. And another thing, segment your subscriber list, community list as much as you can. Get to know your members, not just by, the company size, all of this, like geo, where they live, but if you have information about their specific challenges, you can get them into small groups, and you can send recommendations to watch specific sessions, almost like a watch party with a group of attendees who face a similar challenge. This is actually the best way to build the community down the road, because if people were able to connect over experience, and then they would want to continue continue that conversation in small groups or something along those lines. So, and we took a first stab at it. We didn't do a good job. Like, we did okay job on it. So it's something that we will be improving on. But this was one of the biggest learning, that we got some positive feedback just by trying to do that. I don't know if you remember at the conference when you joined us, we also hosted speaker dinners when we would select people based on who they are and put them at the table of 8 other people. And I would spend like hours trying to figure out, okay, David, he might want to meet that person. Okay, maybe they have similar backgrounds. They do speak.
I remember that. Yeah, that was cool.
So this is actually my favorite thing to do, just in general. So I would spend like hours on
just matchmaking.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's so interesting hearing you say all this about virtual events. I remember a couple of years ago when I was still in marketing, a lot of us were saying like, oh, webinars are so old school. They're dying. Who cares? No one wants to sit for a webinar anymore. Here we are a couple of years later, and it's like, it's a proven model that people are still interested in. It seems like it's the content you're saying, but you've mentioned community a couple of times now. How have you been thinking about building community around these sort of events?
Yeah, and I want to quickly comment on the webinar fatigue, and that webinars are dead in general. I think the fact that what COVID enabled us with is the new technology. We had so many new players that came into the space, including Zoom, or even though Zoom started before that. But really now you can turn your webinar into interactive Q&A with attendees by, for example, limiting attendance to 50 people. And then after the interview is done, you can break everyone down into groups of 5 so they can discuss key takeaways. So this format wasn't at least popular. Maybe it was possible before, but there are so many technology solutions that now emerged that help us make these webinars more interactive. But yeah, the important part, it needs to be connected to the very relevant content. But transitioning to your community question is really community building in comparison to events, if we just draw parallel, regardless of they're in person or virtual. When for events, what is the most important is to make sure that there is a purpose or goal for the event. The reason why you're doing it, it's very high impact, and it's about creating an experience. Communities a little bit different because they're really revolve around people, their core beliefs, who people are long term. So it doesn't have to, events amplify communities, but you don't have to necessarily have an event for people to connect over their beliefs. It's almost like a little bit more of ongoing. So it's more about values, core values and beliefs, what you stand for. Events are more about the goals. So I think those two, the combination of both is really, especially for us, we always build event-based communities. So events almost like a catalyst to activate community members. But then communities are spaces where after they activated, there is a conversation happening, regardless of whether there's an event or not.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I want to ask you more about that, creating that space for conversations. When I think of communities, I think of all the graveyard of Slack groups I've been added to over the years that kind of either are not active or people just self-promotion, or like Facebook groups as well. So what does it look like to create that sort of space for community and conversations?
You know, sometimes, and again, this is very recent thought, you don't really need necessarily to have that space or platform to have a community. You can have a newsletter, right? And if it's really engaging, it might seem like it's a one-way communication, but it's community is about the sense of belonging and also about utility in a way, and it's about your community members helping each other. So, and it doesn't necessarily have to be shown like and displayed, put on the public display. So I would say that the value of community doesn't have to be measured by the number of Slack messages or like engagement on Slack, because different communities would interact differently. What's the most important part is the cadence and the depth of all of these conversations. So I agree. Some people are challenged by, you know, I'm a part of tons of Slack groups. We created our own Slack groups and we eventually shut it down because the engagement died after the conference. And we need to, the most active communities are where the right people are added to that community at the right time with a purpose. And there is also enough critical mass for them to get to engage. That's what I realized recently, especially after reading Andrew Chen's book, The Cold Start, which I highly recommend. He spoke at our events.
I just ordered it on Amazon, so I'm excited for that. It's been all over my Twitter feed.
Yeah, it's. I'll send you the interview with him. What he said is very interesting, and there's a lot of parallels between communities and network effects.
Yeah,
in general. So made me rethink the entire community overall concept. But it's going back to conversations. It doesn't have to be Slack. It doesn't have to be Discord where you have these conversations. It needs to be some kind of a cadence and connection between you, your community members, and them independently from you, because otherwise it would be just one-way communication.
Yeah, this is, now that you frame it this way, and I'm learning live right now and trying to explain my thoughts, is when I think of people who've built community really well, or people like, maybe you heard of like Cody Sanchez, Eric Sue, Ramit Sethi, where they have a newsletter and it's the people who follow them or subscribe are people who have similar values, as you said. And I think Cody just hosted her first event in Austin, got a bunch of attendees. I know Eric's been hosting his events now that they're allowed to, and got a bunch of attendees, not because they've all already known each other, but because they have shared values and they all follow Eric and he has the same values. So they come expecting to meet others with similar values. So who cares if there's no Slack or Facebook group? You know that if you go to this event, you'll find people similar to you.
Yeah, and people who attended the event, that usually they understand the story behind it, right? So they know the right people to invite next time. And this is the best growth ever, the organic word of mouth growth. But in order to create that, they need to experience something that they have a very clear understanding what it is and what kind of people they can invite, what experience would look like. And that's, for me, when it comes to events, this is what I'm the most fascinated. When I enter a new event, sometimes, I don't know if you ever experienced, you just feel like everything seems to be right here.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just feel like, okay, there's something is off here. I cannot, pinpoint what exactly.
Yeah, kind of in the first couple of minutes, you're like, I'm probably